Welcome to this year's Tabula Poetica reading series. This is our 5th year. My name is Anna Leahy. I'm the director of Tabula Poetica, and I curate this reading series. Our one remaining event after today, we have a talk later, a poetry reading later today. Our one remaining event is the MFA poetry reading on December 16th at 4 p.m. in Fish Interfaith Center. I'm up here in part so that you can take some time to turn off your cell phones or silence them. As you're doing that, I want to thank some of the people and organizations that make Tabula Poetica possible. Most of the support for this project comes from the English department, so I want to especially thank our department chair, Joanna Levin, who's here today, and I think we should give her a round of applause. She's doing a great job as chair and is incredibly supportive of the variety of events we've got going on, especially those that involve students. I also want to thank our administrative assistant in the department, Debbie Thacker, who does the logistics for this reading series, and also my graduate students who are assistants for Tabula Poetica and my class, David Krausman and Erica Hoffmeister, who is here today. Leatherby Libraries and Fish Interfaith Center continue to be great hosts for these events. This year we also have support from the Dean of Students Office and the Department of History, and these co-hosts helped us with these very special Veterans Day events today. We are grateful, as always, for small grants from poets and writers through a grant they received from the James Irvine Foundation. Today, to introduce the poet, I'd like to welcome Charlene Baldwin. She's the Dean of Leatherby Libraries. Charlene has been tremendously enthusiastic for Tabula Poetica and all things poetry here on campus. I think you'll see her enthusiasm as soon as she gets to the podium. I also want to point out that Leatherby Libraries is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, and Charlene has made, over the last decade, the library a real hub for campus, both intellectually and culturally. And the events today for Veterans Day are part of the library's 10th anniversary celebration as well. So I'm very pleased she's introducing the poet for the talk today. Please welcome Charlene Baldwin.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me to be part of this. We love having the poetry readings in the library, and we hope to see all of you this afternoon at 4 over in the Leatherby Library's second floor of the Henley Reading Room. Today is Veterans Day, Armistice Day, as it was previously known. 11, 11, 11. That is at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, an armistice was signed ending hostilities between the Allies of World War I, that is Europe and the US, and Germany. It was to be the war to end all wars, but of course it wasn't. Established as a national holiday in 1919, Armistice Day honored those who died in conflict. By 1938, it became Veterans Day, to honor all veterans, living or dead. Today, then, it seems especially important to welcome a poet to campus whose subject matter is the myths and realities of American wars and how these conflicts affect individuals and generations. Interdisciplinarity is a buzzword on many college campuses. Chapman University embraces this concept and encourages faculty and students to work across disciplinary boundaries. The Center for American War Letters and its War Letters Archive in the Leatherby Libraries preserve, protect, and make available more than 100,000 letters from soldiers and their families from all American conflicts. These letters tell personal stories, poignant, sometimes mundane, and are being utilized by students and researchers in history, English, sociology, religious studies, law and theater, and poetry, a truly interdisciplinary resource. Lorene Delany Ullman, our featured author today, has published a prose poem collection entitled Camouflage in the Neighborhood, which won the 2011 Sentence Award. Poet Jane Hirschfield said it is, quote, unlike any book of poetry or prose poetry you'll read this or any year. Ms. Delany Ullman's poems have appeared in various anthologies and literary journals, including TAB, the Journal of Poetry and Poetics. She worked in our region's aerospace industry for 10 years, including as a technical writer at Boeing. Always a good day job for you English majors. She now teaches at UC Irvine, where she's also a consulting editor for the journal Fault Line, which I presume runs through UC Irvine. Please join me in welcoming Lorene Delany Ullman this afternoon.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you, Anna, for the invitation. It really is a privilege to be here on Veterans Day, the day that we honor all American and all vets from all wars, essentially. So the title of my talk, as you can see here, is War and Poetry, the Pain and Pleasure of the Contemporary War Poem. And I'm going to address three different approaches to writing the war poem, to kind of entering into that content. My objective is to show how these approaches suggest that there is more than one entryway into the content of war. And this is a content that is often also has a larger social purpose. But there's also pleasure in poetry, and I aim to show that there's also pleasure in the war poem, and that ultimately the pain and the pleasure are really inseparable and actually complete the poem in a way that the poem would not be a success without it. The first example that I'm going to address is Brian Turner, his poem, Here Bullet. And he is a soldier poet who has firsthand experience with war. A second example that I will address is Duna Mikhail. She is an Iraqi poet. She also has firsthand experience with war, but as a witness to war. And I chose Turner and Mikhail's poems because they both reveal the pain of war in what I believe is an aesthetically pleasing way, which I know that seems kind of at odds. But they also are poets that inspired my own work. And so I'll have brief close readings of Brian Turner's poem, Here Bullet, and then Duna Mikhail's poem, The War Works Hard. And then I'll close by talking about my own example, my own approach, in which I actually had two different entryways into the material in writing a book of prose poems about war. The subject of war is vast and deals almost exclusively in human misery, mayhem, and violent death. And war has been the subject of poetry since the Iliad, so there is a long and diverse history of the war poem. And the obvious pain of war poetry is its content. However, there are thought to be positive outcomes of war. So, for example, war heroes or the liberation of the oppressed, victory and peace, those would be considered positive things, yet those things always come at a cost to one side or the other. And so I did some research, and one person in particular that really kind of spoke to me in terms of talking about war poetry, or actually war in arts, is this longtime war correspondent for New York Times, Alyssa Rubin. And she recently brought her perspective to an exhibit of art in France, and it was called The Disasters of War, and it ranged from 1814 to 2014. So it literally had 200 years of war imagery side by side. And so the exhibit included paintings and etchings, sketches, photography, and video. And in her review of the exhibit, Rubin writes, and I quote, "The atrocities that war reporters record and that seem new are, in fact, centuries old, and the unsparing eye of the artist can render the experience every bit as ugly and painful as a camera can record." And so allow me to rephrase Rubin. The contemporary poet can render the war experience as horrific and painful as a camera or a news reporter can record. But poetry differs from the uses of ordinary language, especially that of a journalist, in poetry, the attention paid to language is in both form and function. So as readers, we have certain expectations when we come to poetry. We expect and depend on the care in which the poet has chosen language. We expect some sort of musicality of language. We expect some sort of precision and surprise in lineation and stanzas. And then we also expect some sort of form, maybe a traditional sonnet or free verse or even a prose poem. So we expect a coherent and unified structure. And then as readers, we also expect that a significant theme or thought will be conveyed. And we expect, according to poet Michael Ryan, giving us the experience from poetry. And then we also expect to be emotionally and intellectually engaged. And so all of these expectations, whether they are met or not, are part of the aesthetically pleasing elements of the poem, the pleasure of poetry, and are inextricable from content of the poem if the poem is to work as a complex unit. So now I'm actually going to move into and talk a little bit about Brian Turner. Brian Turner served as a U.S. entryman in Iraq and Bosnia-Herzegovina. He is probably one of the most recognizable soldier poets in poetry today in the U.S. He earned his MFA from the University of Oregon and then served 7 years in the U.S. Army. So he had his MFA before he went into the Army. And he actually wrote poems kind of secretively while he was in combat near Mosul. And he says himself, and I'm quoting Turner here, "It's hard to be hard-nosed if you're writing poetry." He didn't want his soldiers to think he was writing about flowers and stuff like that. So he was very well aware of kind of the stigma maybe given to the poet in the combat zone. And so I'm actually going to play an audio for you of Brian Turner, but I actually have the poems as well that I can pass out here. Okay, so this is Brian Turner reading here Bullet in November of 2005, and this is actually when the book was first published. And the reason why I'm showing you to Brian Turner himself is that I think it's really powerful the way that a poet reads his own work. And this is especially true with Brian Turner. Of course, now I can't find the person. Okay, so I'm going to offer a brief close reading, and I'm actually going to kind of separate some of the painful content from the pleasurable aspects of the poem, and then I'll talk about how they kind of interrelate together. So as the soldier poet, he has firsthand experience, and as a reader, I feel that firsthand experience as through the direct address to the bullet. It's a lyric poem, it's compressing the speaker's emotion, and in that compression, there's additional added emotional weight. The poem begins in the conditional. The speaker offers, "If a body is what you want, then here is bone and gristle and flesh." So the mood of uncertainty is set immediately, and that's especially important since I, as a reader, know the consequences of the bullet. I understand the implications. So the poem is one of mental torment and pain, and both the fear of impending death as well as defiance in the face of death. And you can hear that defiance in his voice when he reads the poem. And I think that the speaker is suggesting in not knowing at what moment death will occur, does a soldier yearn for what he feels might be the inevitable? I feel both the terror and that defiance, which for me is heightened by the fear of the unknown, that moment of death. And especially as the poem culminates in the last line, where the world ends every time. So then if we had to think about some of the pleasures of the poem, though, well, for me, the repetition is one of the most noticeable and pleasurable aspects of the poem. The word bullet is repeated 3 times, starting with the title, and the word here is repeated 9 times, and it's a pretty short poem for that kind of repetition. And because of that, I think the here becomes incessant and dramatic and rhythmic. It builds intensity, it gathers force, it pushes the reader, again, towards that last line. And then I also enjoy the language of the poem, the use of language that's related to guns. So for example, in the lines, the barrel's cold esophagus, triggering my tongue's explosives for the rifling I have inside of me. So these lines acquire meaning beyond the usual definition of those words, trigger, explosive, and rifle, because of the unexpected use of those words in those lines. In addition, there's the participle form of words, hissing, triggering, and rifling. Again, that produces a kind of action that pushes the reader towards that last end where the world ends every time. And then I also enjoy the music of the language in the near rhymes, in the words gristle, flesh, and wish, and then also in the words leap and gap. So ultimately, the sound and the rhythm of the words and sentences help create that emotional experience that we feel, and that the painful content is intertwined with the pleasure of the poem. And even though I've tried to separate those elements, ultimately the form, the structure, and the texture are inseparable, and they are essential to the meaning and the success of the poem. The second example that I'm going to talk about is Iraqi poet Duna Mikhail, who was forced to flee her homeland in the 1990s when authorities became too interested in her satirical writings. In her book, The War Works Hard, she writes about the Iraq-Iran War of the 1980s and both Gulf Wars. Her book provides an eyewitness account of life in Baghdad from 1985 to 1996. Mikhail says of her own writing, and I quote, "Most of my writings serve as documents of witness. They document what I saw." So she truly is the poetry of witness, or the poet of witness. And so I'm going to play the audio of Duna Mikhail reading, and you can follow along with your handout. So as a poet of witness, Mikhail has endured social extremities, historical extremities. She's endured war, political repression, military occupation, and forced exile. So the poem is, The War Works Hard, is a catalog of the horrors of war. And it's as if it's presented as if it's magnificent, as if the reader is looking at a grand cathedral or a majestic scenery. So it is irony at its best. In the first lines of the poem, the phrase "how eager and efficient" brings to mind a well-oiled machine. The war machine is ready to roll and kill with precision and skill and competence. And for me, as a reader, that is one of the most terrifying aspects of the content, is that this machine feels like it's unstoppable. As a part of the cataloging, the speaker specifically names the horrors, from ambulance to swinging corpses, stretchers, mines in the fields, fireworks and missiles, artificial limbs, orphans, coffin makers, grave diggers. All of those bring forth the terror and the carnage of war. Mikhail's work is testimony to those who usually do not have a voice, the victims of war, which are typically women and children. And I think her work is actually explicitly anti-war. But part of the pleasure of The War Works Hard is her use of irony. The personification of war gives war its own agency. It becomes an entity that's independent. The war is given attributes of a corporation or a machine. It's eager, efficient, diligent, and it continues working day and night. So again, kind of gives you that feeling, that unstoppable feeling. Yet war it's also ironic in that war is not heroic, war is not glorious, war is not magnificent. It is destructive and horrific. And so her use of irony in this way, I think, is surprising and imaginative, and for me, very intellectually pleasurable. And then the irony is further developed and reinforced through her use of relentless active verbs. So verbs starting with wakes up, dispatches, swings, rolls, digs, entertains, urges, inspires, awards, achieves, teaches, builds, invigorates. And a lot of these verbs actually have positive denotations, yet war is giving us violent death. And then I know it might seem odd to say, but I actually enjoy her use of exclamation points. It's not very often that you can get away with using exclamation points. I mean, they're kind of the too loud punctuation. But for her, in this poem, it actually helps accentuate the irony, because the speaker is making this emphatic declaration about war. War is, how magnificent the war is, how eager and efficient. And then at the end, the war works with unparalleled diligence. So I feel like those explanation points are earned. And Mikhail presents war differently than Turner, who is the soldier poet, and we know from her biography that she has indeed witnessed and been a victim of war. This gives her a different kind of authority, and it's a credibility that I also find compelling. As a mother, wife, and humanitarian, Mikhail provides a woman's perspective on war when war is still considered a male-centered world. And so I find that point of view empowering, but also intricately braided with the pain of war. For some readers, some war poetry may seem therapeutic, it may seem more authentic, it may be more expressive of those human values that are typically trampled in war. And I think this kind of catharsis is also pleasurable for some readers. In both Turner's and Mikhail's poems, the painful truth of war is really, it's embodied within the sounds, the rhythm, the syntax, and the voice of the poem. The pain and pleasure are intertwined, and both are necessary to giving us the experience. Okay, so now I'm actually going to question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the exclamation points and how those are working within the poem, and I was wondering what you made of the ellipses.
The ellipses. Oh, dislodging many things from under the ruins.
Yeah. There's a couple more times.
Yeah, there are. I mean, to me, those are really just pauses in a way, leading to what is really going to be a horrific detail. Some are lifeless and glistening, others are pale and still throbbing, meaning that they still have life in some ways, but they've suffered tremendously and are, have not even actually been dead very long. So it really kind of creates this additional horror with those ellipses. That's actually a really good question. So she really uses punctuation to her advantage, I think, which I think is really interesting to think about when you're writing poetry in any form, that you want that punctuation to do as much work for you as possible. So actually now I'm going to talk about my own approach to writing the Camouflage for the Neighborhood and how I came to write this book about war through prose poems, essentially. And I'm going to return to Alyssa Rubin and her review of the Disasters of War art exhibit, because she raises questions about those who tell the story of war, whether as artists or journalists, and I would actually include poets as well. And she asks, and I quote, "Are gore and blood the most important things to portray, or is it the moment of utter grief that follows? What is the truest way to show the cost of victory and the pain of defeat? How much of our understanding of war is mediated and shaped by those who interpret it for us?" Well, my book, Camouflage for the Neighborhood, is a result of trying to understand how war is mediated and shaped, not only by those who interpret it, but also by those who produce it, who sell it, and consume it, and all the while mythologizing and romanticizing war. So what finally brought me to speech? Well, I found two main entryways into the material, and one was mostly accidental, and the second was somewhat methodical. So I'll start with the accidental, which I just dropped on the floor, actually. Here we go. So the accidental was that I have a tendency to look down when I walk, and I was walking through a theater parking lot, and there was a little army man like this on the ground behind a car tire, and I don't know why, but I decided to pick it up. And, I kind of just looked at it, and then I put it in my pocket, and I forgot about it. And then a few weeks later, I was wearing the same coat, and I stuck my hands in the pockets, and there it was again. And it just, for some reason, became this way of me to start thinking about how war is present in our everyday culture. And so I actually did a little bit of research on plastic army men, and found out some really interesting things that helped write a poem. And then I actually was led to do some research of my ancestry, and what I found was that my family history is seeped in American war and the military all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And that was kind of astounding to me. I felt like I had this legacy of war, even though I felt myself to be anti-war. So ultimately, what else happened was that I grew up during the Cold War, which was a time that was very tense, and my brother and his friends would play war. And so I actually have a couple of images that are taken from that time frame to kind of give you an idea of what playing war looked like in the 1960s. Oops, and I'm still struggling with this, but there we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is, we called it the airplane park, and this is actually a Navy jet from the Korean War that's still in this park today. This is actually Lions Park in Costa Mesa, but it was freshly there in 1961. So it was kind of a fun thing to crawl on, and it got really hot actually though, so you couldn't, it had to be not a too hot day. And so I'm there in the picture somewhere. There's neighbors of us, and we're all playing on the Navy jet, which I just think it still strikes me as a weird thing to be in a park. Okay. And then let's see if I can. I'm having trouble. There we go. This was the backyard fort. And this is actually the third iteration of the backyard fort. This was like the grand final backyard fort. And so this was actually in our neighbor's yard. You can see my roof right behind it, but we played constantly back and forth between the two yards. And of course, this was the boys' domain. This was not, the girls were not allowed in the fort unless they were gone, and we would sneak up there. And actually, you can see in this picture, he's holding a gun through the little turret hole there. And this was built by our fathers, okay? Oh, too fast. Let me get back to that one. So this one is circa 1963. So my brother is kind of the one on the actual smaller fort. So this was the first iteration of the fort, and you can see that it became much grander when it was on the telephone pole. But these are it's my brother and his two friends. They're dressed in fatigues that my mother made for them. They're holding guns that they made from wood. So this war culture was very present in our play lives, which I just think was really interesting, especially since we still do that today with kids. Oops. Okay. And that's the image that actually became the cover of the book. Okay. We made it a little bit darker. I didn't want it to be too happy. I thought the real color photo made it a little bit too happy. So the Army man, coupled with this Cold War experience, and then I worked in the aerospace industry for 10 years. And so I really got to see how much money actually goes into building planes for war and actually for peace. And that was a really astounding experience, actually, working for a company that is building warplanes, essentially. And so finding that little Army man kind of was the final catalyst that gave me this very distressing realization that I am complicit in the American military-industrial complex, that I am not only a participant, but I am also a spectator. I'm both spectator and participant in the American military-industrial complex. And help, I'm part of that really perpetuating the war culture in the United States. I'm part of the war machine, even if unintentionally. So that was somewhat striking to me. And then just to give you a little bit of background, a little bit about the military-industrial complex, according to historian and journalist Nick Terse, today the military-industrial complex is comprised of the government and defense companies, but it also includes the Hollywood entertainment industry, it includes Marvel Comics, and it also includes NASCAR. So, and that's just a few of those kind of entertainment-like companies that have this relationship with the Pentagon in terms of producing things that are war-related. And so here's a few examples of how I'm still complicit. I have enjoyed films like Captain America. I mean, my husband and I go to those kind of films, and so, that's Marvel Comics and the Pentagon. I've purchased camouflage clothing for my grandson. I draw the line at guns. I will not purchase a gun. And then, I own a pair of boots that look like combat boots, essentially. So it's all around you. It's very hard to escape it. And so the book became this place of junction where all of these narrative strands came together. I didn't specifically have an idea of a book in mind when I started writing. I just kept writing as I observed both the explicit and implicit signs of war around me. So the poems range from the Great War to World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam War, the Iraq War. There's also poems about the war against the body, poems about games of war, and poems about working for war. Yet, there is pleasure in the making, right? There is pleasure in the crafting of a poem, and no matter how arduous the writing process might seem, or how difficult the material might be, if I have learned something in that process, then I consider that to be some sort of pleasure. And then there's also pleasure in actually either trying to meet the expectations of poetry or challenging those expectations. So I believe that there is pleasure in creating that kind of work. And I also believe that in every work of art, and poetry being one of those, that it has to find its own way of communication that is particular to it. And for me, in this case, this book was prose poetry. I hadn't really written a lot of prose poetry prior to that, but that was the form that I was able to communicate what I wanted to write about. So I didn't have the techniques of like enjambment or end stop like you would if you were writing in lines. So I had to depend more on subtlety and economy, rhythmic kind of constructions in diction and syntax in order to make the poem, the prose poem, more poem-like. And then there was a second, more methodical entryway, and that is from reading Helene Sixou's book, 3 Steps on the Ladder to Writing. And Sixou writes about her inaugural moment. The first moment she became aware of her own mortality, and she believes that we all write from that moment. And so for me, after I read that book, I thought about, what is my inaugural moment? And for me, it occurred in 3rd grade, when my teacher, who was most likely the child of interned Japanese parents during World War II, she showed the class, which was essentially 7 and 8-year-olds, these very vivid, graphic, black and white photographs of children being burned by the atomic bomb after it was dropped on Hiroshima. Really horrific pictures for 3rd graders. At least it was for me. And then, so for me, that in combination with the Cold War drills of duck and cover that we now do for earthquakes instead of an atomic bomb, I had nightmares so severe that my mother called the principal to complain. She was that kind of mother. So I've been trying to write from that moment again and again because it formed a core truth for me, which is that children die. And even though I'm no longer a child, I fixated on that child consciousness, that awareness of death that was heightened by the threat and the propaganda and the tension of growing up during the Cold War. And I focused on that as a moment to write from. So to encourage you to do the same thing, I actually have little army men for everyone. So you can grab your little army man. You can consider this a token of remembrance for today. And what I would like you to think about is, what is your perspective on war? You can allow the toy soldier to be a trigger or initiation of sorts for a poem, a meditation, some thoughts on war. You might ask yourself, when did you become aware of the atrocities of war, or the pain of defeat, or the cost of victory, or the grief that follows. So I'm going to ask you to take, I don't know if you have pens and pencils with you, but take 5 minutes to write, or even to just think about your inaugural moment, or even thinking about today is Veterans Day, a day that we honor our vets for their sacrifice for the common good. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes kind of silence, and then I will conclude in 5 minutes. And I'm going to close with two quotes. One is from New York Times war correspondent Alyssa Rubin, and the other is from poet Denise Levertov. First, Alyssa Rubin. Rubin states, and I quote, "The vocabulary of war, whether images or words, must be reimagined by each new generation of artists as it seeks to depict the consequences of conflict." And I would add to Rubin's statement that I think it is important for us to continue to address the constancy of the war culture in the United States, to give voice to the pain of war in all its guises. And then Denise Levertov, she writes, "One of the obligations of the writer, and perhaps especially of the poet, is to say or sing all that he or she can to deal with as much of the world as becomes possible to him or her in language." And I just think that quote is really key to kind of understanding maybe even what our responsibilities are as poets. And I think that we should not allow the journalist, we should not allow Hollywood, we should not allow popular culture to mediate all our experiences of war. The perspective of the poet on war is necessary and important to the national conversation and debate on war. So you have something started maybe in your 5 minutes of writing, keep writing. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for Q&A, so if you have any questions, now would be the time to ask the question.
Yes?
When you sat down to write this book, or maybe not specifically this collection, were you intending on doing prose poetry? Is that your style, or did that just come?
I had written a few prose poems prior to that, but I was still not sure about using the prose poem as a form. But it really helped open up the material for me, because some of the material seemed so like factual or so honest that I couldn't seem to write in a lyric, for example. And the tendency for me to write when I write lyrics is that they're too compacted, too condensed. And I really wanted to open it up. So it helped, it allowed me to kind of open up with the language. Yeah.
Would you speak about what happened between technical writing at Boeing to
Okay, sure. I mean, technical writing is a very different kind of writing, but it paid the bills really well. And what happened is I worked for Boeing for 10 years. Well, it was McDonnell Douglas became Boeing. And they were going through massive layoffs. And so I wanted to go back to grad school, and so I took a voluntary layoff and went back to grad school. And originally I was actually in budgets, where I was actually doing finance. I was doing all the numbers, and then I ended up in technical writing. And I think it helped being in business for 10 years, actually, before going back to grad school. For me, it did, because grad school was easy compared to working at Boeing. I mean, I was working 60, 70 hours a week, and grad school seemed like a vacation almost. And I just loved being in school. And so that, I actually am still in school, essentially, because I'm teaching. So I've kind of stuck there. So I really just kind of took that opportunity to change careers. And the technical writing, I still use it occasionally. I still do some consulting work for a marketing firm where I do write technical things. But for the most part, I really kind of have to separate it, because it's such a different kind of writing, essentially.
Well, I would think that the facts and the information that you learn from the technical writing could give authority to your poetry.
Yes, and I think what happened is that when I first went back to grad school, and I was so intent on concentrating on poetry, that I kind of discarded my whole background in tech writing and tried to write these lyric poems that were just so compacted and weirdly strange, but not effective. Because I was trying to use language in a different way than the tech writer. And I think what happened with the prose poems is that it actually kind of opened it up for me to kind of connect both of them together in a way. Yeah.
I think you said that you did not see this as a book project initially.
No, I didn't.
Can you talk a little bit about that process of writing individual poems and when you decide it's a book and then how you generate that many pages and put them in order, that sort of book writing process?
Well, I probably had maybe 10 pieces, kind of thematically around, war, and then I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I'm interested in this. I mean, I have to be able to stay interested in it, and I just decided that I was going to keep writing, and I didn't really think about how I was going to shape the book. That really came much later. So I typically in my process, I just write, and I probably wrote maybe 100 pieces before I ever started to think about how am I going to organize this. And it actually took 2 separate trips to Vermont Studio Center, which is a writer's retreat, to try to figure out how to organize the material. And I ended up, it went from 100 pages to a much shorter book because there were just some pieces that just weren't working and cohering. So it really was, I just keep writing until I can no longer write on that topic, and then I try to figure out, is this a book? I mean, I felt that I was thematically staying on track, but by the time I had 100 pieces, there were some that were clearly did not work in the theme.
Would you say this little army man is your Madeline cookie?
Yes.
It brought you to that moment of significance that you remember as a child, fearing the Cold War around you.
Right. Yeah, it definitely brought a lot up, and thinking about those things, especially after I'd left the defense industry, essentially, when I was working there, I didn't think that I was contributing to the war culture. I really wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking about day-to-day life and trying to make a paycheck. And so outside of that industry, when I think about what I was doing, and my husband still works for that company. In fact, he has secret clearance. There are things he can't even tell me. So we kind of talk about, it's like he works for the mafia because we can't talk about work. And so to me, it's really conflicting for me. And it still is, because on one hand, we have become this war culture, and on the other hand, that's what puts food on my table. So it's just a constant kind of conflict.
To wrap things up, a lot of the people in the audience are undergraduate creative writers. Some of them are also writing fiction in addition to poetry. What advice would you have for the long haul?
For the long haul in terms of writing? Well, what works for me is that I have multiple projects, actually. So I'm not writing on just one project. I'm actually writing probably on at least 2 at the same time, so that when one feels like it's not moving, I can go towards the other one. I think collaborations are actually a really great way to go. I'm collaborating with an artist, and that has been so helpful and just inspiring to my whole process. To see how someone else works in a different medium really can help your own process. And I would highly recommend that if you have a chance to collaborate, that you try it, because it really is amazing what you can produce from that. So those are 2 things that I would probably say.
All right. Thank you very much.